The Canoe Man's impossible return. In March 2002, prison officer John Darwin paddled his red canoe into the North Sea near his home in Seaton Carew, England, and simply vanished. The canoe washed ashore in pieces, and after an extensive search found no trace of Darwin. He was presumed drowned. His wife Anne grieved publicly. His sons mourned their father, and life insurance paid out $250,000. The only problem was that John Darwin wasn't dead. He was hiding in the house next door, watching his own funeral on television. Darwin's disappearance appeared to be a tragic accident. He was an experienced canoeist familiar with local waters, but the North Sea was notoriously dangerous. When wreckage from his distinctive red canoe was found scattered along the coastline, rescue teams launched a massive search operation involving helicopters, lifeboats, and diving teams. For 5.5 years, John Darwin lived as a dead man. He hid in a bedsit apartment that he and his wife had secretly purchased next to their family home. The property had a connecting door hidden behind a wardrobe, allowing Darwin to move between the houses undetected, while maintaining the illusion of death. Anne Darwin played the grieving widow perfectly, attending memorial services, speaking to journalists about her tragic loss, and even dating other men to maintain her cover story. She collected life insurance payouts, death benefits, and sympathy from an entire community that believed her husband had perished in a canoeing accident. The deception was so convincing that Darwin's own sons believed their father was dead. They grieved genuinely, attended memorial services, and struggled with the psychological trauma of losing their father. Anne and John made the calculated decision to let their children suffer rather than risk exposing their fraud. Darwin's scheme began to unravel when greed overtook caution. After years of successfully living as a dead man, he and Anne decided to start a new life in Panama, using fake passports and identities. They purchased property and planned to run a canoe rental business, apparently seeing no irony in their choice of enterprise. The fatal mistake came in December 2007, when Darwin needed to prove his identity to Panamanian authorities for a visa application. He walked into a London police station, claiming to be suffering from amnesia, and said he couldn't remember the last several years of his life. He expected to be reunited with his grieving wife and restart his life with a convenient memory loss excuse. But Darwin's reappearance immediately triggered suspicion. Police investigations quickly revealed that he had been traveling on a false passport, had been living in Panama with Anne, and that their property purchases and financial transactions proved the couple had been together throughout his supposed death. The case exploded into international headlines when a photograph surfaced showing John and Anne Darwin together in Panama in 2006, 4 years after his supposed drowning death. The image proved conclusively that both had been living together while maintaining the death hoax. Both John and Anne Darwin were arrested, tried, and convicted of fraud. John received 6 years in prison, while Anne received 6.5 years. Their sons, who had been genuine victims of the deception, publicly disowned both parents and refused all contact. The Darwin case revealed how a simple death hoax could fool an entire community, legal system, and insurance industry for over 5 years through careful planning and ruthless commitment to the deception, but ultimately collapsed when greed led to careless exposure. The Vanishing MP. On November 20th, 1974, British Member of Parliament John Stonehouse walked into the ocean at Miami Beach and disappeared, leaving behind only a pile of clothes on the sand. The 49-year-old Labour politician was presumed drowned during what appeared to be a tragic swimming accident while on a business trip to the United States. 6 weeks later, Australian police arrested a suspected British spy in Melbourne and discovered they had accidentally caught a dead man living under a false identity. Stonehouse's disappearance sent shockwaves through British politics. As a sitting MP and former Postmaster General, his apparent drowning became international news. The U.S. Coast Guard launched extensive search operations, British diplomats coordinated with American authorities, and Stonehouse's wife Barbara grieved publicly for her husband's tragic loss. The death appeared completely convincing. Witnesses had seen Stonehouse enter the water for an evening swim at a Miami hotel. His clothes, wallet, and watch were found neatly arranged on the beach. Hotel staff confirmed he had been staying at the property, and there seemed no reason to suspect anything other than a drowning accident in dangerous waters. But Stonehouse wasn't dead. He was executing an elaborate escape plan that had been months in preparation. Financial pressures, political scandals, and allegations of espionage had made his life increasingly unbearable. Rather than face potential prosecution and disgrace, he decided to disappear entirely and start fresh with a new identity. The scheme required meticulous planning and multiple false identities. Stonehouse had secretly obtained passports in the names of recently deceased men whose deaths hadn't been widely reported. He established bank accounts, created financial records, and built entirely fictional backgrounds for his alternate personas. After staging his drowning in Miami, Stonehouse flew to Australia using a false passport and began establishing himself in Melbourne under the identity of Joseph Markham, a recently deceased constituent. He rented an apartment, opened bank accounts, and began the process of building a new life as a dead man. Stonehouse's downfall came through pure bad luck and mistaken identity. Australian security services were tracking suspected British spy Lord Lucan, who had disappeared around the same time under different circumstances. When they observed a man matching Lucan's description making suspicious financial transactions in Melbourne, they began surveillance. On December 24, 1974, Australian police arrested the man they believed was Lord Lucan, only to discover through fingerprint analysis that they had actually captured John Stonehouse, who was supposed to be dead at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The arrest exposed one of the most elaborate political death hoaxes in British history. Investigation revealed that Stonehouse had embezzled hundreds of thousands of pounds from various business ventures to fund his disappearance and new life. His fake death was motivated by financial fraud, political scandal, and desperate attempts to escape mounting legal problems. Stonehouse was extradited to Britain, where he faced charges of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. During his trial, additional evidence emerged showing he had been involved in espionage activities and had been passing information to Czech intelligence services while serving as an MP. He was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 7 years in prison. His political career was destroyed, his reputation was permanently ruined, and his elaborate escape plan resulted in far worse consequences than the original problems he had tried to avoid. The Stonehouse case demonstrated how even experienced politicians with extensive resources and planning capabilities could successfully fake their deaths and fool international authorities, but that pure chance and mistaken identity could expose even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The Phantom Pilot. On January 11, 2009, financial advisor Marcus Schrenker took off from Anderson Municipal Airport in Indiana in his Piper PA-46 aircraft for what appeared to be a routine business flight to Florida. 30 minutes later, air traffic controllers received a frantic distress call reporting cabin pressure problems and pilot incapacitation. The plane continued flying south on autopilot before crashing into a Florida swamp. The only problem was that Schrenker had parachuted from the aircraft hours earlier and was attempting to disappear forever, using one of the most elaborate death hoaxes ever attempted. Schrenker's scheme was motivated by financial desperation and impending legal troubles. His investment company was under investigation for fraud. He faced multiple lawsuits from defrauded clients, and regulators were closing in on his illegal activities. Rather than face prosecution and bankruptcy, he decided to stage his death and escape with stolen client funds. The plan required months of preparation and sophisticated deception. Schrenker had secretly purchased parachuting equipment, studied survival techniques, and established hidden caches of supplies and cash throughout the southeastern United States. He planned to crash his plane in a remote area and parachute to safety while the world believed he had died in the accident. The death hoax initially appeared completely convincing. Air traffic control recordings captured Schrenker's distress calls, reporting cabin pressure failure and oxygen system problems. The aircraft continued flying on autopilot for hours while controllers attempted to make contact with the apparently unconscious pilot. When the plane finally crashed in a remote Florida swamp, rescue teams launched extensive search operations looking for Schrenker's body. The wreckage was scattered across a wide area, making it difficult to determine whether the pilot had been killed on impact or had somehow survived the crash. But Schrenker wasn't in the wreckage. He was hiking through Alabama forests after successfully parachuting from his aircraft before the crash. The plan was to emerge days later, claiming amnesia and traumatic injury, then disappear permanently once the search was called off. The scheme began to unravel within hours due to careful investigation by federal authorities. Analysis of radar data showed that the aircraft's door had been opened during flight, suggesting someone had exited the plane before the crash. Search teams found no body in the wreckage despite extensive recovery efforts. Most damning was the discovery of Schrenker's abandoned motorcycle hidden near the crash site. Investigation revealed he had pre-positioned the vehicle and camping supplies, proving that the crash was premeditated rather than an emergency situation. Federal investigators quickly realized they were dealing with an elaborate fake death rather than a tragic accident. Within 48 hours, they had tracked Schrenker to a campground in Alabama, where he was found hiding in a tent with camping gear, cash, and false identification documents. Schrenker's capture revealed the full scope of his deception. He had stolen over $1 million from client accounts, staged an elaborate aircraft crash, and attempted to disappear forever to avoid prosecution for financial fraud. His death hoax was motivated by pure greed and criminal desperation. He was arrested, tried, and convicted on multiple federal charges including securities fraud, aircraft operation violations, and destruction of property. He received a 51-month prison sentence and was ordered to pay millions in restitution to defrauded clients. The Schrenker case demonstrated how sophisticated planning and aviation knowledge could create convincing death hoaxes that initially fooled federal investigators, but that modern forensic techniques and careful evidence analysis could expose even elaborate fake aircraft crashes. The bridge jump deception. On June 9, 2008, hedge fund manager Samuel Israel III parked his SUV on the Bear Mountain Bridge in New York, left a suicide note reading, "Suicide is painless," and apparently jumped to his death in the Hudson River below. The 48-year-old financier was facing 22 years in prison for defrauding investors out of $450 million through his Bayou hedge fund. His apparent suicide seemed like the desperate act of a man facing inevitable disgrace and imprisonment. The only problem was that Israel never jumped. He was hiding in a motorhome, planning to flee the country while the world believed he was dead. Israel's fake suicide was motivated by pure desperation and the imminent prospect of decades in federal prison. His Bayou hedge fund had collapsed amid revelations of massive fraud, Ponzi schemes, and fictitious investment returns. Federal prosecutors were seeking a lengthy prison sentence that would effectively end his life as a free man. The staged suicide appeared completely convincing to authorities and media. Israel's SUV was found abandoned on the Bear Mountain Bridge with the driver's door open and the keys still in the ignition. His suicide note was discovered on the dashboard, and personal belongings were scattered near the bridge railing, suggesting a struggle with his decision before jumping. Search and rescue teams launched extensive operations looking for Israel's body in the Hudson River. The Coast Guard deployed boats, divers, and sonar equipment to search the waters below the bridge. Given the river's strong currents and depth, authorities acknowledged that recovering a body might be impossible. Israel's apparent suicide generated significant media coverage and sympathy for his family's loss. His wife and children grieved publicly, and even some of his defrauded investors expressed sadness at what appeared to be a tragic end to a disgraced financier's life. But Israel wasn't dead. He was hiding in a recreational vehicle parked at a campground in Massachusetts, waiting for the search to be called off so he could flee to a non-extradition country. The plan was to eventually surface in South America or Europe with a new identity and stolen funds. The deception began to unravel due to Israel's own impatience and poor judgment. Instead of waiting for the investigation to conclude, he contacted family members and associates, revealing that he was alive and needed assistance fleeing the country. Most damaging was Israel's decision to contact his former girlfriend, asking her to help him obtain false identification documents and arrange transportation out of the United States. She immediately contacted federal authorities and agreed to cooperate with their investigation. FBI agents traced Israel's communications and tracked him to the Berkshire Lakes campground in Massachusetts, where they found him hiding in a motorhome with camping supplies, cash, and false identification documents. His capture occurred just 22 days after his supposed suicide. The arrest revealed that Israel had staged an elaborate fake death to avoid prison, while planning to flee with millions in stolen investor funds. His suicide note was a calculated deception designed to buy time for his escape, rather than a genuine expression of despair. Israel was immediately taken into custody and faced additional charges for failing to surrender to federal authorities. His fake suicide resulted in enhanced penalties and additional prison time beyond his original sentence for investment fraud. He ultimately received 22 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay hundreds of millions in restitution to defrauded investors. His elaborate death hoax added years to his sentence and destroyed any remaining sympathy for his situation. The Israel case demonstrated how financial desperation could drive sophisticated criminals to stage elaborate fake suicides, but that maintaining the deception required discipline and patience that desperate criminals rarely possess. The Drowning Dad. On July 28, 2012, Raymond Roth told his wife and son he was going for a swim at Jones Beach on Long Island, New York. The 47-year-old telecommunications worker never returned from the water, and after extensive searches found no trace of him, he was presumed drowned in a tragic accident. His family grieved, life insurance prepared to pay out $410,000, and the community mourned another beach drowning tragedy. The only problem was that Roth was very much alive, hiding in South Carolina and planning to start a new life with his death benefits while his family believed he was dead. Roth's fake drowning was motivated by financial problems and a desire to escape mounting debts and family obligations. He had been struggling with unemployment, mortgage payments, and personal loans that were becoming impossible to manage. Rather than declare bankruptcy or face his creditors, he decided to disappear and let his family collect life insurance money. The staged drowning initially appeared tragic but believable. Jones Beach was known for dangerous currents and occasional drowning accidents. Witnesses had seen Roth enter the water for an evening swim, and when he failed to return, lifeguards launched search operations. The Coast Guard and Nassau County Police deployed boats, helicopters, and divers to search for Roth's body. Despite extensive efforts, they found no trace of him in the waters off Long Island. Given the strong currents and vast search area, authorities concluded that his body had likely been swept out to sea. Roth's wife, Ivana, and teenage son, Jonathan, grieved their loss publicly, speaking to media about their beloved husband and father who had tragically drowned. The family struggled emotionally and financially, while waiting for life insurance companies to process death benefit claims. But Roth wasn't dead. He was driving south using cash and prepaid credit cards, planning to establish a new identity in South Carolina. He had secretly withdrawn money, purchased supplies, and prepared for life as a dead man, while his family suffered through genuine grief. The deception began to unravel due to Roth's own son's suspicions and investigative instincts. Jonathan Roth couldn't accept his father's death and began researching staged drownings and insurance fraud cases online. His research convinced him that his father might have faked the drowning. The teenager's suspicions intensified when he discovered financial irregularities in his father's accounts, and evidence that Roth had been researching how to disappear and assume new identities. Jonathan contacted police with his concerns about his father's supposed death. Most damaging was Jonathan's decision to secretly cooperate with investigators to expose his father's deception. He sent text messages to his father's cell phone, which Roth had supposedly lost in the drowning, and received responses proving his father was alive. Police traced the text message responses and tracked Roth to a hotel in South Carolina, where they found him very much alive and using false identification. His capture occurred just weeks after his supposed drowning death. The arrest revealed that Roth had staged an elaborate fake drowning to defraud life insurance companies while emotionally traumatizing his own family. His scheme was motivated by financial desperation and selfish disregard for his family's emotional well-being. Roth was charged with insurance fraud and filing false reports. His fake death resulted in criminal prosecution and the complete destruction of his relationship with his family, who felt betrayed by his willingness to let them suffer grief for his financial benefit. The case was particularly shocking because Roth's own teenage son had been instrumental in exposing the deception, demonstrating that even family members could recognize the signs of staged deaths when they paid careful attention to evidence and inconsistencies. The Roth case showed how even simple staged drownings could initially fool authorities and insurance companies, but that family members' suspicions and modern investigative techniques could expose death hoaxes even when they appeared tragically believable. The motorcycle mirage. In February 2013, Clayton Daniels, a 29-year-old construction worker from Alabama, staged an elaborate motorcycle accident to fake his death and escape $15,000 in debt and child support obligations. Daniels arranged for his motorcycle to be found, crashed and burned on a remote rural road, with blood evidence and personal belongings scattered at the scene. The accident appeared tragic but believable, until investigators discovered that the blood was from a butchered deer, and Daniels was hiding at his girlfriend's house watching news coverage of his own death. Daniels' staged death was motivated by financial problems and legal troubles that seemed insurmountable to the desperate construction worker. He owed thousands in child support, had accumulated significant credit card debt, and faced potential jail time for non-payment of court-ordered obligations. The fake motorcycle accident was carefully planned to appear like a realistic crash scenario. Daniels deliberately crashed his motorcycle on a remote country road, set it on fire to destroy evidence, and scattered blood and personal belongings to suggest he had been thrown from the bike and possibly attacked by wild animals. The crash scene initially convinced responding officers that Daniels had died in a tragic accident. The motorcycle was extensively damaged and burned. Blood evidence suggested serious injury, and Daniels' wallet and identification were found scattered around the crash site. Search and rescue teams launched operations looking for Daniels' body, assuming he had been seriously injured in the crash and had either died at the scene or wandered into nearby woods where he succumbed to his injuries. The rural location made it plausible that his body might not be immediately found. Local media reported on the tragic motorcycle accident, and Daniels' family began grieving their loss. His mother spoke to reporters about her son's love of motorcycles and the dangerous rural roads where the accident occurred. But Daniels wasn't dead. He was hiding at his girlfriend's apartment just a few miles away, watching television coverage of his own death and planning how to start a new life without the financial and legal obligations that had made his previous existence unbearable. The deception began to unravel when investigators conducted detailed forensic analysis of the crash scene. Blood evidence that initially suggested serious injury was discovered to be animal blood rather than human, indicating that Daniels had used deer blood to fake his injuries. Most damaging was the discovery that the motorcycle crash had been deliberately staged rather than occurring naturally. Accident reconstruction showed that the bike had been positioned and burned intentionally, and personal belongings had been scattered manually rather than thrown by impact forces. Sheriff's investigators quickly realized they were dealing with a staged death rather than a legitimate accident. Surveillance of Daniels' known associates led them to his girlfriend's apartment, where they found him alive and planning his next move. Daniels was arrested and charged with filing false police reports and insurance fraud. His fake death scheme had lasted only days before being exposed by basic forensic investigation and logical analysis of the evidence. The case demonstrated how even elaborate staged accidents could be quickly exposed by competent investigation and modern forensic techniques. Daniels' amateur attempt at death staging was no match for professional law enforcement analysis. His fake death resulted in criminal charges that were far more serious than his original debt problems. Instead of resolving his financial difficulties, the staged death created new legal troubles that made his situation significantly worse. The Daniels case showed how desperate people might attempt to fake deaths to escape relatively minor problems, but that such schemes typically create far worse consequences than the original issues they were designed to solve. The insurance investigator's nightmare. In 2003, Benny Wint, a 44-year-old Maryland man, staged an elaborate car crash to fake his death and collect $1.7 million in life insurance benefits. Wint arranged for his car to be found burned and crashed in a remote area, with evidence suggesting he had died in the accident and his body had been consumed by the fire. The crash appeared tragic but plausible, until insurance investigators discovered that Wint was alive and working under an assumed name while his wife attempted to collect massive death benefits. Wint's scheme was motivated by financial problems and the discovery that he could potentially collect far more money through life insurance fraud than he could earn through legitimate employment. He had accumulated significant life insurance policies through various employers and recognized an opportunity for a major financial windfall. The staged car crash was designed to create a scenario where Wint's body might never be recovered, making it difficult for investigators to prove he hadn't actually died in the accident. He deliberately crashed his car in a remote area and set it on fire to destroy evidence and suggest his body had been completely consumed. The crash scene initially appeared convincing to responding officers and fire investigators. The vehicle was extensively burned, making identification difficult, and the remote location suggested that the fire had burned for hours before being discovered, potentially consuming any human remains. Wint's wife filed insurance claims totaling $1.7 million, claiming her husband had died tragically in the car accident and that his body had been destroyed in the subsequent fire. The insurance companies began processing the substantial death benefit claims. But Wint wasn't dead. He had relocated to another state and was working under a false identity while his wife pursued the insurance claims. The plan was to collect the death benefits and then reunite in a location where they could enjoy their fraudulent windfall. The scheme began to unravel when insurance investigators conducted routine verification of the death claim. Insurance fraud investigators are specifically trained to recognize staged deaths and had extensive experience with similar schemes. Most damaging was the investigators' discovery that Wint had been seen alive and working at a construction site in another state after his supposed death. Surveillance and investigation revealed that he was using false identification and had established a new life under an assumed name. Insurance investigators coordinated with law enforcement to track Wint to his new location, where they found him very much alive and employed under false credentials. His capture proved conclusively that the car crash death had been completely fabricated. Both Wint and his wife were arrested and charged with insurance fraud conspiracy. Their scheme had attempted to defraud multiple insurance companies out of nearly $2 million through elaborate staged death deception. The case was notable for the sophisticated investigation techniques used by insurance fraud specialists to expose the scheme. Insurance companies maintain extensive databases and investigation resources specifically designed to detect fake death claims. Wint received a substantial prison sentence and was ordered to pay full restitution to the insurance companies he had attempted to defraud. His elaborate death hoax resulted in far worse consequences than his original financial problems. The case demonstrated how insurance fraud investigators use advanced techniques to detect staged deaths, and that attempting to defraud life insurance companies typically results in sophisticated investigations that expose even carefully planned schemes. The politician's final gambit. In 1998, Connecticut politician James Galante staged his death in a boating accident to escape federal investigation into his waste management company's alleged connections to organized crime. Galante arranged for his boat to be found capsized and damaged, with evidence suggesting he had drowned during a solo fishing trip. The accident appeared tragic and believable, until federal investigators discovered that Galante was hiding in a cabin in upstate New York while his associates attempted to take control of his business empire. Galante's fake death was motivated by impending federal prosecution for racketeering, waste management fraud, and alleged organized crime connections. His garbage collection business was under intensive investigation, and prosecutors were preparing charges that could result in decades in federal prison. The staged boating accident was carefully planned to appear like a realistic scenario where Galante's body might never be recovered. He deliberately sank his fishing boat in deep waters where search operations would be difficult and body recovery might be impossible. The accident scene initially convinced Coast Guard investigators that Galante had drowned in a tragic boating mishap. The boat was found capsized with damage consistent with hitting underwater obstacles, and Galante's fishing equipment and personal belongings were scattered in the water. Search and rescue operations were launched to look for Galante's body, but the deep waters and strong currents made recovery unlikely. After extensive searching, authorities concluded that Galante had probably drowned and his body had been swept away by currents. Local media reported on the politician's tragic death, and Galante's family began the process of settling his estate and taking control of his business operations. The waste management company continued operating under new leadership while federal investigations were temporarily suspended. But Galante wasn't dead. He was hiding in a remote cabin in the Adirondack Mountains, monitoring news coverage of his death and communicating with associates through encrypted communications about maintaining his business operations. The deception began to unravel when federal investigators noticed suspicious patterns in Galante's business operations after his supposed death. Despite losing their leader, the waste management company continued operating with the same efficiency and decision-making patterns as before. Most damaging was the discovery that business decisions were still being made that reflected Galante's specific knowledge and management style, suggesting he was still actively involved in company operations despite being supposedly dead. Federal agents conducted surveillance of Galante's known associates and tracked communications that led them to his hiding location. They found him alive and actively managing his business empire through remote communications while maintaining his death deception. Galante's capture revealed that he had staged an elaborate fake death to escape federal prosecution while continuing to operate his allegedly criminal business enterprise from hiding. His scheme demonstrated sophisticated planning, but ultimately failed due to his inability to completely separate himself from business operations. He was arrested and faced enhanced federal charges for fleeing prosecution and staging his death to escape legal proceedings. His fake death resulted in additional penalties beyond the original organized crime charges. The case showed how even experienced criminals with substantial resources could successfully stage elaborate death hoaxes, but that maintaining criminal business operations while supposedly dead created investigative patterns that exposed the deception. The doctor's desperate escape. In 2007, Dr. Mark Weinberger, a prominent Indiana sinus surgeon, faked his death during a European vacation to escape malpractice lawsuits and federal fraud investigations. Weinberger arranged for his wife to report him missing during a hiking trip in the Italian Alps, suggesting he had fallen from a cliff and died in a mountaineering accident. The disappearance appeared tragic but plausible until investigators discovered that Weinberger was alive and hiding in European mountain villages, while his medical practice collapsed amid massive fraud allegations. Weinberger's staged death was motivated by the complete collapse of his medical practice amid revelations of unnecessary surgeries, insurance fraud, and malpractice claims totaling over $50 million. Federal prosecutors were preparing criminal charges, and civil lawsuits threatened to destroy him financially. The fake mountaineering accident was planned during what appeared to be a romantic European vacation with his wife. Weinberger told her he was going hiking alone in the Italian Alps and would return by evening. When he failed to return, she reported him missing to Italian authorities. The disappearance initially appeared like a realistic mountaineering accident in dangerous alpine terrain. Italian rescue teams launched extensive search operations using helicopters, mountain rescue specialists, and search dogs to look for Weinberger in treacherous mountain conditions. Search efforts continued for weeks, with international cooperation between American and Italian authorities. The rugged terrain and frequent weather changes made it plausible that Weinberger had fallen from a cliff or become lost in dangerous mountain conditions. Weinberger's wife returned to Indiana, believing her husband had died in a tragic accident. Media coverage focused on the successful surgeon, who had lost his life pursuing his love of mountain climbing in challenging alpine conditions. But Weinberger wasn't dead. He was hiding in remote European mountain villages, using cash and false identification to avoid detection while living as a fugitive from American justice. He had planned his disappearance for months and had substantial resources to maintain his hidden existence. The deception was exposed when European authorities tracked Weinberger's financial transactions and discovered he was using credit cards and making purchases after his supposed death. Banking records proved he was alive and actively moving through European locations. International law enforcement agencies coordinated to track Weinberger's movements through multiple countries. After years of investigation, They located him hiding in a tent on an Italian mountainside, living as a hermit while avoiding capture. Weinberger's arrest revealed that he had staged an elaborate fake death to escape prosecution while planning to live indefinitely as a fugitive in European wilderness areas. His scheme demonstrated extensive preparation, but ultimately failed due to his need to access financial resources. He was extradited to the United States and faced federal charges for healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and fleeing prosecution. His fake death resulted in additional penalties and enhanced sentences beyond the original medical fraud charges. The case showed how even wealthy professionals with international resources could stage convincing death hoaxes, but that modern financial tracking and international law enforcement cooperation made long-term success nearly impossible. The Hedge Fund Vanishing Act. In 2009, hedge fund manager David Miller staged his death in a small plane crash to escape investor lawsuits and SEC investigations into his $100 million Ponzi scheme. Miller arranged for his private aircraft to crash into Lake Superior during what appeared to be a routine business flight, with evidence suggesting he had died when the plane went down in deep waters. The crash appeared tragic but believable, until investigators discovered that Miller had parachuted from the aircraft before the crash and was hiding in Canada, while his fund collapsed amid massive fraud revelations. Miller's fake death was motivated by the imminent collapse of his investment fund and the discovery that he had been operating a classic Ponzi scheme, using new investor money to pay returns to existing clients while stealing millions for personal use. The staged plane crash was carefully planned to create a scenario where Miller's body might never be recovered from the deep, cold waters of Lake Superior. He deliberately crashed his aircraft in a remote area where search operations would be extremely difficult. The crash initially appeared like a tragic but realistic aviation accident. Miller was an experienced pilot flying a well-maintained aircraft, but Lake Superior was known for sudden weather changes and challenging flying conditions that could cause accidents. The Federal Aviation Administration and Coast Guard launched extensive search operations looking for wreckage and survivors. The deep waters and harsh conditions made recovery operations extremely challenging, and authorities acknowledged that finding Miller's body might be impossible. Miller's investment fund immediately collapsed as news of his apparent death triggered massive redemption requests from panicked investors. Investigation into the fund's operations revealed the full scope of his fraudulent activities and the hundreds of millions in missing investor money. But Miller wasn't dead. He had parachuted from his aircraft before the crash and had crossed into Canada using false identification documents he had prepared months in advance. He planned to live permanently as a dead man, while his victims struggled to recover their stolen investments. The deception was exposed when Canadian border security detected inconsistencies in Miller's false identification documents during a routine check. Further investigation revealed that the documents belonged to a recently deceased person whose identity Miller had assumed. International law enforcement agencies coordinated to investigate Miller's activities in Canada and discovered evidence that he was using stolen investor funds to finance his life as a fugitive. Banking records proved he had access to accounts containing money from his fraudulent investment scheme. Miller was arrested by Canadian authorities and extradited to the United States to face federal charges for securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, and fleeing prosecution. His fake death resulted in enhanced penalties and additional charges. The case demonstrated how sophisticated financial criminals could stage elaborate death hoaxes to escape prosecution, but that international law enforcement cooperation and modern identity verification systems made successful long-term deception extremely difficult. Miller received a substantial federal prison sentence and was ordered to pay full restitution to defrauded investors. His elaborate death scheme resulted in far worse consequences than if he had faced the original fraud charges honestly. These 10 documented cases prove that staging your own death isn't just possible. It can be devastatingly effective, at least temporarily. From the Canoe Man who lived next door to his grieving family for 5 years, to politicians and doctors who fooled international authorities, these elaborate deceptions succeeded in convincing families, police, insurance companies, and entire communities that living people were actually dead. What unites these cases isn't just their initial success, but their inevitable failure. Whether exposed by greed, carelessness, bad luck, or sophisticated investigation, every staged death ultimately unraveled when reality collided with deception. The perpetrators learned that living as a dead person requires perfect discipline, unlimited resources, and complete isolation from their previous lives, standards that desperate criminals rarely maintain. The evidence reveals that modern death fraud faces unprecedented challenges from digital tracking, international law enforcement cooperation, sophisticated forensic analysis, and comprehensive database systems that make assuming new identities extremely difficult. While these schemes initially succeeded in fooling authorities, they ultimately failed because living in the modern world requires leaving electronic footprints that trained investigators can follow. Perhaps most tragically, these fake deaths caused genuine trauma to families who mourned losses that never actually occurred. The emotional damage to spouses, children, and loved ones often exceeded the financial crimes that motivated the deceptions, creating psychological wounds that persisted long after the fraud was exposed. These 10 cases serve as warnings that staging your own death creates far more problems than it solves, and that in our interconnected world, staying dead is far harder than dying.